Chapter 10. Ellie felt a bit nervous to have left her own world, but more than that she felt excited. She learned that she had arrived in the Ivory Realm in their late afternoon, despite leaving her own world in the night. She spent time talking to Rake, and had a stream of curious fairies visiting, introducing themselves and asking a quick question or two before Rake would politely ask them to give her some time and space. Ellie was eager to begin a search for her brother, but she had gained very little sleep in her own world's night, and was hungry and had no idea where she was or where she should go. She was at the mercy of Rake and the elders, who had told her that they would contact the FIB, Fairy Intelligence Bureau, and hoped to arrange to meet them in the morning. When dinner was brought, it was a sort of roasted mushroom with lots of fruit. Ellie really enjoyed it, but felt guilty when Rake pointed out that the amount she had eaten in one meal would have fed a fairy for almost a year. But he also assured her that food was abundant in the forest and there would be no shortage. When the sun set, the forest did not grow dark. It was just lit in a different manner. Some plants seemed to glow, and a swarm of glowing insects appeared in the night. They moved as if dancing, and Ellie saw a couple of fairies flit up and join the insects in their dance-like patterns of movement. Eerie music seemed to filter through the night, although she could not tell where it was coming from. Everything around her seemed magical, yet it wasn't until bedtime that Ellie saw magic being used directly since Rake had made the portal to bring her here. The fairies slept up in the trees somewhere, but Ellie couldn't fly up. Realizing that Ellie had no bed, the fairies still present had a quick discussion before they each reached into the pouches that they wore at their waists and took out a pinch of dust. Rake whispered a single word to her. "Watch." The small group of fairies began to circle a tree. It wasn't one of the enormous trees, but it was at least as big as her house, with trunks and branches that looked strong and unyielding. But as the fairies seemed to sing to the trees, tracing dust-coated fingers along the bark, the tree began to change shape. The huge living organism was moulding itself to their will. One huge branch seemed to swoop down and around the trunk, turning itself into a spiraling staircase. Other, higher branches began to interweave themselves into a basket-like structure, just right for a 10-year-old girl to lie in. Then, before her eyes, from the small branches that lined the basket, new soft green shoots burst forth to form a lush, living mattress. Ellie felt a tear roll down her face, as she felt such gratitude for the fairies and the tree for accommodating her in this way, and a fearful thought for how her older brother might be faring in this strange world, without the help of friends like these. Feeling tired and emotional, Ellie bade the fairies good night and climbed into the tree and her living bed. She hadn't slept properly for 2 nights now, and was drained. As she lay in the bed, the branches seemed to mould themselves to her body, becoming very comfortable, almost as if the tree itself were hugging her, welcoming her. In the tree's embrace, Ellie quickly fell into an exhausted sleep. Rake felt like he had barely wrapped himself in his wings and closed his eyes when something woke him. There was noise in the forest. At night. The forest was a serene place, particularly at night, so any noise was out of the ordinary. But this wasn't just any noise. This was shouting and screaming. It was getting louder and closer. Shaking the sleep from himself, Rake unfolded his wings and dove into the air, unsure where to go. The noise was coming from one direction, which he felt he should investigate. But Ellie had gone to sleep in the other direction, and he felt responsible for her, that he should go and check on her as she was not in her own world and didn't really know anyone or anything. He didn't really have time to decide. The cause of the uproar was moving closer rapidly. That source was definitely not caused by fairies, or anything else that lived in the forest. Rake knew the sound from his tooth-collecting missions. Humans. "We're under attack!" he shouted to anyone near enough to hear, feeling a stab of fear in his stomach. It was the human soldiers of the Goblin King, attacking the heart of the fairy homelands. Then he saw them, the teenage boys charging through the forest waving swords and spears, while goblins rode on the shoulders of some of them, calling out orders. Rake felt terrified for his people. They were not prepared for an attack. He knew he had to get to Ellie. Whatever happened tonight, in the long term the girl was possibly the fairies' best hope to push the goblin forces back out of fairy lands. Rake launched into the air, flitting among the branches and leaves, darting past other fairies that were awake and panicked and unsure what to do. The rampaging forces charged through the forest, seeming to look for something to destroy. The fairy way of life meant that they built little, instead coaxing other life forms to aid them, like trees growing into convenient shapes. But the great trees, at the centre of the fairies' community, held many treasures, had taken millennia to become the fairy city complex that they were. They were enormous, dwarfing the other trees around them. They acted like a beacon, drawing the attacking horde. Fortunately, that was a slightly different direction from where Ellie had gone to sleep. Rake could see pockets of fairies forming, rallying against the surprise attack and coaxing trees and plants into the defense of themselves and their home. With guiding thoughts and a touch of fairy magic, tree branches were beginning to swing down and swat at the attacking soldiers. Swat was how it seemed as the branches bent and creaked their way towards the forest floor to sweep towards the wild teenage boys who rampaged, hacking at anything within reach of their swords. However, when the cumbersome branches did find a target, there was a crunch of bone as boys were thrown across the forest like dolls. Despite the potential power of the trees, they were slow and not very effective. The trained soldiers of the Goblin forces had a big advantage, and Rake could see his friends falling to their horrible weapons. Each time he saw a fairy risking their life, Rake wanted to stop and help them. But he had to ignore that desire to help his friends and family. He had to get to Ellie. The tree that had volunteered to be Ellie's bed came into view, and Rake could see that Ellie was awake, sat up in the bed. As he got closer, he could see that her eyes were wide with fear. He was flying as fast as he could while having to dodge trees that were beginning to bristle with anger as they felt their brothers and sisters being sliced and smashed with goblin-wrought weapons. Ellie saw Rake just as he came in to land next to her. Her face flashed a look of relief, but it switched back to fear.
"What's going on? Are we safe?"
she asked timidly. "The goblins are attacking. The war has begun. And no, we are not safe. We have to get away from here quickly," he blurted out hurriedly. She began to climb out of the hammock-like bed that the tree had formed around her, but then turned and dove back in. Rake thought that she had decided to hide in fear, but then he saw that she had left her wand and bag behind. The tree gently cradled it in green vines and lifted it, extending it towards the girl. She took it, offering a polite
"Thank you"
to the tree. Ellie slid down the branches to the forest floor. But even as she did so, Rake saw a horde of boy soldiers rushing in their direction. Ellie saw it too and screamed at him.
"Quick, make a portal!"
"Yes, a portal, of course." He reached into his pouch of dust, but it wasn't there. He hadn't picked it up when he'd woken up. Without it, he could make a portal just big enough for himself, but not nearly big enough for Ellie. Barely even big enough for one of her hands. "I haven't got my dust," he told her, angry at himself. "We have to run." There was no time, though. The soldiers were already upon them. Ellie backed up against a tree as 5 boy soldiers, 2 with goblins riding on their shoulders, rushed at them. With no dust, Rake could only perform simple spells. He formed a small thought bubble containing the concept that it would be a good idea to attack the other boys, and attempted to launch it at the lead boy. But it slid off him, as the boy's mind was already consumed with goblin magic. So Rake flew at him, aiming to jab him in the eye, but the boy saw him and swept his shield up. The shield, a solid wall of wood and metal many times heavier than Rake, caught him. It knocked the air from his body and sent him sailing through the air to land in a barely conscious heap, unable to stand and struggling to breathe. His dazed mind watched as the boy swung his sword at Ellie, a blow intended to kill as it arced towards her neck. But the skinny girl was quick in her terror, ducking under the blade. The clumsy boy, annoyed at his failure, launched a booted foot at the girl, who was less than half his size. It caught her just above the eye, splitting her eyebrow and releasing a trail of blood down the side of her young face. But Ellie's blood was not the only thing released in that moment. The fear of death, the instinct for survival, and the weight of destiny came crashing together in a flash of light that blinded Rake just as he blurred into unconsciousness.